I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver and a little gold, like that city where the rest will shine. I want a gold one, that silver line. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop, in that bright land where we'll never grow old. And someday yonder we will never more wander, but walk the streets that are purest gold. Don't think me poor or deserted or lonely. I'm not discouraged. I'm heaven bound. I'm just a pilgrim in search of a city. I want a mansion, a robe and a crown. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop, in that bright land where we'll never grow old. And someday yonder we'll never more wander, but walk the streets that are purest gold. Come we that love the Lord, and let our joys be known. Join in a song with sweet accord. Join in a song with sweet accord. And thus around the throne, and thus around the throne. We're marching to Zion.
Good morning. I heard the bell. It's time for us to begin. I guess I ought to use this thing. All right. Now you can hear me. We're on lesson 5 in the Psalms of David and others this morning. Hope that you have a copy of that, or if not, maybe you can pull it up on your phone or tablet and look at that with us. But if not, that's okay too. We will be studying through the Psalms together. We've got 3 pairs of Psalms this morning to look at, and I think I can honestly and truthfully say there's no chance we're going to finish our lesson today. I don't think we can get through it. But we will try very hard to garner some lessons from this as we go through it together. Before we get started, we could have a word of prayer. Who do we need to be mindful of? Obviously, Forrest Ingram. He's trying to get healthy enough to have several bypass surgeries. I assume still at Prattville Baptist. Did they bring him back? He is at South, staying down there. Okay. Cody Oates says he's in need of prayer. Let's be mindful of him. I saw that Kevin Moody is sick. They weren't able to be with us this morning. Who else?
My husband's homesick. He's been sick for about 3 weeks now, just trying to.
Dave, homesick.
It's just a revolving.
Got the crud and can't get rid of it.
Yeah, can't get rid of it.
Speaking of the crud, poor Ansley is at home. Beth's with her this morning. She's got the crud. She's had her tumor removed, but they're still waiting to hear back about whether it was malignant, and I would assume further treatment would be needed. So let's be prayerful for her as well. Brother Dave, would you mind to lead us in prayer?
Let's pray. God, our Heavenly Father, we thank you for all things. We thank you for this chance to be together to study from your word. We appreciate Jeremy and the lesson that he's prepared. God, we ask that you help us to look to Psalms and the various things that David spoke about and the other writers. Help them to be applied to our life. God, we pray for those that are missing today. We pray for those that are dealing with sicknesses right now. We're especially mindful of those that are having recent surgeries, and we ask that you help them to recover quickly. We also are thinking about those that are in Jamaica and the Caribbean islands that were hit by that hurricane. We pray for the Christians there, those that are of your church, but also those that are without. We ask that you help them to see that you are the hope. We pray these things in your Son's name. Amen.
David mentioned Jamaica. I got a text from David Bass yesterday about, I guess, lunchtime, said that he had made it there safely, that they were coordinating with some of the ones from the preaching school, and obviously more information to follow. But I don't know if you saw the email that, I guess, is it the next 2 Sundays, is that right? If you'd like to put in a special contribution note on your check, you can put that in or give it to the elders so that we can send some funds down there through the School of Preaching. I think it's through Wetumpka Church of Christ, but nice to know that David's there on the ground kind of coordinating those efforts and seeing where those needs are. We'll be starting in Psalm 34, if you'd like to turn there this morning. The lesson that we have before us, the author does a good job of kind of giving the historical context so that we remember where David is and what he's dealing with as we look at these Psalms together. I'll admit there are a lot of words in this lesson, and that's tough for me. I have a hard time. I'm more of an outline style preacher or teacher, and so when there's a lot of text in the lesson, it makes it hard for me to know what to say and what not to say, but try to run through the historical context pretty quickly. Kyle set us up pretty well last week, I think, with the history of where we were. But realize now that David is a full-time fugitive from Saul. He had tried to reconcile, as we looked at it last week. That did not work out, and so he's had to go full-time on the run away from Saul. And Saul has really, in a lot of ways, gone full-time in pursuit of David. He's spending a lot of time, a lot of energy. He's using a lot of his soldiers, a lot of his resources in pursuing and trying to kill David at this point. And unfortunately, to the detriment, I think, at times of the nation and some of the issues and problems that they're having with the Philistines. But in his desperation to escape from Saul, David actually goes and tries to hide with the Philistines. But he shows up there, and they remember the song that was sung about David, how he killed a bunch of Philistines, and they're not really impressed by his need, his struggle, his desire to hide from Saul, to the point that he actually kind of pretends to be insane. He kind of goes mad. He lets the drool get in his beard, and he kind of, I think, marks on the gates of the city there, because it's looking like he's about to be in a mess. He's going to be in trouble. So he's able to kind of pretend he's insane and get booted out rather than get captured or killed. But that doesn't work for him very well at all. But as he goes on, we see even that there was a priest that assisted David and gave him the sword that he had slain Goliath with, gave him some food and some help. Saul actually comes along behind him and puts the priest to death, kills several priests because of their helping David out. There's also the information here. This is all 1 Samuel 21 to 31. But there are several different locations that David continues to go to. And we see the account of him in a cave, and that his family and some of the supporters come to him. About 400 men is what David has on his side at this point. And we see that Saul, at least at one point in this account, brings 3,000 men with him. And so David's extremely outnumbered as he's on the run. In spite of that, David goes up and assists and helps the people in Keilah and is able to help overthrow their enemies. But unfortunately, because of that, it kind of puts a target on their back as far as Saul is concerned. And so he's not able to stay there either. He has to go to the wilderness of Ziph, the wilderness of Judah, depending on your translation and what you read there, and continues moving kind of from one place to another throughout the wilderness. But we know of two accounts where Saul and David come very close together by happenstance or because of God's providence. In one case where David and his men are in a cave and Saul comes in on them, and then in another case where Saul is resting and David and one of his men go to that place. And so there are some real close interactions here where David has an opportunity to take advantage of that and to take care of Saul, to kill Saul and to put this problem to an end. And yet we see David struggling with that decision and struggling with the decision to not do that. He has this it seems like dual idea about what he ought to do, because he knows that he's been anointed as the king. He knows that he's well within his right as far as a person that's being chased and continually under threat from Saul if he were to put Saul to death. But at the same time, he says, I can't do this because Saul is my rightful king and Lord at this point, and because God anointed him first. To the point where even when he cuts the hem of, he cuts a little corner off of Saul's garment, and then he immediately feels bad about it because he said, I shouldn't do this because this is the king. And so we see kind of this struggle that David continues to have, not only physically striving to stay alive, to stay safe, to stay fed. He's struggling to feed his men, those who are following him, but he's also struggling with these opportunities that he has to take Saul out, but then not doing it because he's trying to give Saul his due as God's anointed, and also to work within God's plan and God's timing. And so that's really the context here. And then as we get down to the end of what he has here as far as the context, Samuel had died, and then also Saul and his sons met their death at the hands of the Philistines. But I think the Psalms that we'll probably get to today, we're not quite to that point. We're still in the point of David fearing for his life and having to run away from Saul and being really chased around. He's not able to stay in any one place very long. So let's look at Psalm 34, and he's got these paired up. So it's 34 and 56 together. We'll probably spend more time in 34 and then kind of briefly run through 56 and then look at the lessons possibly from those that we can take. But in Psalm 34, he says, possibly expresses David's outlook on things as he saw them while in enemy hands. So thinking about the time that he went to the Philistines and almost was captured there and had to kind of avoid that, and thinking too about later when he went back to the Philistines, but as they were attempting to wage war against Saul, and he was kind of in a bad spot to decide, was he going to help the people he was with or help his people? And some of those Philistines that came in from other places said, why are the Hebrews here? They shouldn't be here. They're our enemies. And he had to get out of that situation as well. So there were multiple times that David not only didn't have a place because of Saul, but he also didn't have a place where he had tried to run for refuge, and was really kind of between what we would say a rock and a hard place. He was painted into a corner several times during this period in his life. And so as we look at Psalm 34, just let's be mindful of what David perhaps was going through as he was dealing with these things. Let's start with verses 1 through 3. If somebody would read Psalm 34, 1 through 3.
I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together.
What does the title of Psalm 34, the little subtext maybe, say in your Bible if you've got that?
Praise to the Lord.
The happiness of those who trust in God.
Okay, do you have anything else in there?
Taste and see that the Lord is good.
And we know there's a song we sing that has that phrase in it, right? Mine says, of David, because mine has kind of typically, if they know, there's a context there. Of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech so that he drove him out and he went away. And so this is that time when he kind of had to go act crazy so that he could get away. And so a time that's really tumultuous in David's life. And the first thing he says in this psalm is, I will bless the Lord at all times. I don't know about you, but it can be very hard to have that kind of attitude or that mindset or sit down and write those type of words if you're in a time in your life that's a struggle or that's full of tumult or terror or fear. I don't know how many times maybe you've been in that place in your life, but if you have, this may not be the first thought that comes to your mind. And yet that's David's priority here, to say, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. The author of our lesson here says he might easily have supposed that Jehovah probably didn't care a great deal about someone who he had allowed to be driven into this situation. Instead, he declares his intention to bless the Lord at all times. His trust in God never depended on his physical circumstance. And the other point the author makes here, really around verse 2, is that he didn't have anything to boast of among the Philistines, right? If anything, he had to be kind of careful around the Philistines not to boast, because his boast at this point in his life really was, hey, he killed a bunch of them. And maybe not so many as what the song said, but they had developed that song because of his great victory over their champion, Goliath. And so he's got to be very careful about that. But what does this verse 2 say that David boasted in? My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. And it's interesting, too, in verse 3, he calls for everybody around him, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. And so I would take that to mean, and I would have the understanding that David's followers, those people who had gathered around him, they were with him for a couple of reasons. Probably, yes, because he was a mighty warrior and they'd seen him take out Goliath. Probably also because they understood the context about his anointing and the fact that he was bound to be the next king. But more than anything, it was because they trusted God like he did. They were true God followers like he was. And we know that a good portion of those people were his family and friends. Verses 4 through 7, if somebody would read that.
I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. They looked to him and were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him, and saved him out of all of his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear him and delivers them.
And so it's interesting here. I sought the Lord and he heard me, or he answered me, depending on the translation. Do you ever feel like God doesn't hear you or maybe isn't looking at you? Have you ever been in a place in your life where you kind of wonder what's going on? If God's really looking out for you? I'll say this, I've had a blessed life. We've definitely had our hardships, but nothing that I would say has been pits of despair level hard. And maybe that's just an outlook thing, or maybe that's just my life has been blessed in that way. But I know that there are people who have had extremely hard times and have been in a place that seems probably the lowest of the low. And yet God, even in this place in David's life, was listening. And he says God answered him. But the important key is he says first, I sought the Lord, right? We've got to make sure that we're continually seeking him if we expect him to answer us or to know what we need. And of course, God knows what we need better than we know. But he wants us to ask. He wants us to speak to him. And he says, those who look to him are radiant. Their faces shall never be ashamed. He was in this horrible situation and really an outcast among his people, an outcast according to the king, somebody who deserved to be killed, and yet he was able to keep this attitude of radiance and not being ashamed because he understood that the person he needed to worry about and look toward was God. And then he also talks about the fact that the angel of the Lord camps around those who fear him. They had that safety. What do you think their camp was like? Brother Larry can probably answer this better than most people in the room. Brother Larry, what do you think their camp was like with 400 people constantly in fear that Saul was going to catch them, typically kind of bouncing around in wilderness areas and places that the enemy controlled? What do you think happened when it was nighttime and time to go to bed?
Well, they probably had David in the middle and everybody else sort of surrounding him and people on guard.
Definitely had a watch, I'm sure, right? And probably some sort of rings of security, people that were looking outward at all times. Were supposed to be awake anyway, looking outward. I remember doing that in my training for the Army, at basic, but also at the officer school that I went to. And at one point, even laying there on my mat with my M16 kind of laid across me, because I wasn't technically on shift or supposed to be on guard, but we all knew something was going to happen, right? And so you're semi-aware even when you're not the one on watch. But very difficult to rest that way, isn't it? It's really, really hard to feel confident that you can go ahead and take some sleep. And so imagine as they continue to run away from Saul and they are in this state of high alert at all times, it becomes more and more evident that you're tired and that you're wearing out. And so for David to be able to say, the angel of the Lord's around our camp, what kind of a confidence that is that he had in God, that God would protect them in that way. Any comments about this so far as we trying to move pretty quickly, I know.
In verse 2, it says, my soul shall make its boast in the Lord. He couldn't boast about the things that he had done, right? But
Right.
that's just as dangerous in many ways for him to say that while he's in the Philistine area, because, when he took Goliath, he shouted to the Philistines, this day the Lord will deliver you to my hand. Come to you in the name of the Lord. And then he says later, all the assembly shall know the Lord does not give or save with the sword and spear. The battle is the Lord's. And so that was probably just as dangerous in many ways. But
Well, and that's one thing we saw. David definitely wasn't willing to compromise on God to find safety with the Philistines, right? He didn't go over there and knock on their door and say, I'm willing to convert. No, hey, I'm here and God's here with me. You going to let us in or not? So he was very staunch in that way of being solid with God. So that's a really good point. Maybe he wasn't boasting about his own accomplishments, but he's still saying, hey, I'm here and God's here with me. And he had made it pretty clear what God thought of the Philistines on multiple occasions. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely they should know. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
I think it's an interesting picture of the camp, because most military camps are not places of good things. There's carousing, there's drinking, whatever, aside from the people guarding. But the Lord could protect and encircle his camp because the Lord was in the camp too. Like they were behaving as God's men.
Yeah.
I'm certain David made sure that happened.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the qualifiers there, right? The angel of the Lord surrounds the camp of those who fear him, and delivers them. It's the ones who fear him. You're exactly right.
I think
That's a really good point.
How the Israelites, the 12 tribes were commanded to set up their camps as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. David reminds us of how the Israelites were commanded to set up their camp, and how those things ringed around and focused on the tabernacle and where God's presence was. Think about that in the context of today. It says it right on our money, right? That God's part of this nation. And we have, I think, sometimes maybe a bit of a false perception about God's blessings on the United States and what that means for us. But I think we have to be very careful about conflating the two. Yes, we definitely are a blessed nation. But I think if you look specifically at verse 7, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him. Is that, as a whole, is that us anymore? Is that our nation? And so I think we need to be very mindful of that and be teaching people and trying to get back to a place where hopefully that can be a majority again here in this country. Imagine, if you will, being 400 strong and knowing that Saul has, I don't know, he brought 3,000 one time, but how many soldiers did Israel have at this time? I don't know what the number is. A lot bigger than that, right? There was no way that David numerically, physically, could beat Saul. There was no way that he could do it out of his own might or his own valor. The only way that David could get through this part of his life was leaning on God. And that's what he did wholly as we look at the psalm. Yeah, there maybe was doubt at times about why things were being allowed to happen. But one thing we never see waver is David's faith in God. Verses 8 through 10. Somebody read that.
Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him. Oh, fear the Lord, ye his saints, for there is no want to them that fear him. The young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but they that seek the Lord shall not want any good thing.
Who are the young lions he refers to here in verse 10? Terry says maybe drawing from nature the idea of the older, more mature lions kind of eating first and the younger lions having to wait. Any other ideas or thoughts about maybe what he means here?
The younger lions are often like figured out to like go find their own pride. So I would figure David would feel a lot of commonality with them, like he's just out there trying to survive.
The author says here kind of more along that line of he kind of conflates these young lions with David's men. Some of these probably that end up being mighty men of valor. You know, they're strong, they're courageous, they're kind of used to being able to provide for themselves and make their own way. And now they're in this situation where they're hiding. Nobody will give them anything, and they're stuck, right? They're physically hungry. But they also feel that despair of being out there in the wilderness and not able to return home or to have the resources they're used to. And so they're having to learn to rely on God probably even more fully than they ever had before. It's really easy to say you trust in God when you also kind of trust in yourself to get it done. But it can be a lot harder to trust in God when you actually realize that, oh, wait, I can't do this without Him. I think that's probably a really, really hard lesson to learn. Verse 11 through 16.
Come, you children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Who is the man who desires life and loves many days that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The faithfulness of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth.
He kind of shifts gears here almost. It's like teaching time all of a sudden. And David adds in these verses about, to me, maybe speaking to those young followers of his, if we think about the young lions from the previous verse. Let me tell you the way that you can keep God on your side and the way that you can prevent being hungry. And it involves these things, keeping your tongue from evil, keeping from speaking deceit, turning away from evil and seeking peace. But also to realize that the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous and his ears toward their cry, but that his face is turned against those who are evil. And so he kind of gives them the comparison here of where they need to be and maybe where some of their cohorts are, the people that are pursuing them are. And so he just reminds them God is unchanging, right? The principle that he wants to give them is trust in God and be righteous, do what God says, and that's the way that you have God on your side. Any thoughts or comments about this?
Peter writes to those
Absolutely. Terry mentions that Peter quotes this passage in speaking to those who are suffering persecution as well. 1 Peter chapter 3. Let's finish this psalm up. If somebody will read 17 and just keep going through 22, and we'll combine these sections.
The righteous cry, and the Lord heareth, and delivereth them out of all their troubles. The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. He keepeth all his bones, not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and they that hate the righteousness shall be desolate. The Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate.
So let me ask the question. Do you believe that when the righteous cry for help, the Lord delivers them out of all their troubles?
Depends on whose viewpoint you're looking at it from.
What do you mean?
There are afflictions that I've asked to have God get me out of, but it's not always provided in the way that maybe I had hoped or expected or whatever. So we also believe that everything works to the good of God. It's always God's will, things of that nature. So those have to be married somehow.
So that kind of leans into my next question, which is, what does it mean when it says all their troubles, right? I think we have to be very careful about defining what our troubles are. Because this verse says God will deliver you from all your troubles. And we know, though, that we have troubles, right? And as we read a little further down, bad things do happen to good people, right? But we have to be very careful to understand what David said. God's deliverance and what we ask for as deliverance may be two different things, right? Because God understands what we need better than we do. Or God understands what the eventual benefit of a hard situation may be when we can't see that. I can think of several times in my life where I know that God delivered me from a hardship or from some sort of struggle. I can look back multiple times, even thinking about not really physical health or anything, but just thinking financially on the very bare surface of things. Times when we thought we were in real trouble or we really were struggling, but we got through those things and we were able to move forward. I'm sure that you can think about those kind of things in your life when somebody popped up and blessed you in some way that you didn't even realize they were looking, had no idea that they knew. And maybe it is physical health related. You can think about a way that you got through a situation that seemed it was insurmountable. Whatever it may be, we can all think about those things. But probably on the flip side, we can think about times when we thought something should be fixed and it wasn't. Saul had that in his life, right? He asked God multiple times to get rid of that thorn in the flesh. And we know that God left him with that. But there was a reason for it. And in the same way, I think there's a reason for us. I know that those same difficulties that we've had in our lives have probably put us in a position to be empathetic and to be able to speak to other people about those things. And we wouldn't have had that opportunity or that ability to reach out to those people if we didn't have that experience as well. And so there's so many ways that God can deliver us from our troubles.
Well, the ultimate deliverance is verse 22, the redemption of our souls.
Right? And that's what matters, period. Right? That should be the only part of that actually matters. You're exactly right. Anita points out.
Patience is the key, right? So we ask for deliverance, so to speak. We ask to bring us through these difficult times and tribulations. But God will answer it in His time, on His schedule, in His will. And we need to be more patient and open to doors He may be opening that we may not understand what that will deliver us from, through. Because we went through these times, like you just said, we're better prepared in the future.
So Jeremy, to kind of go along with what Anita said, anyone that can sing this song has been delivered through their troubles at because they're still alive, they're still able to praise God. And ultimately, redemption is the deliverance. So at some point, your health is gonna fade to the point that you're gonna pass. And we may view that as not being delivered from the trouble, but yet if we've remained faithful, we ultimately are, so.
Absolutely. I think it all has to do with our outlook on it, right? Or our focus, of what it is that we are prioritizing. Because if we're worried about that redemption of our soul, the rest of it falls into place. The rest of it becomes as important as it is, which isn't as important as that redemption and that thing that's most important. And that's what allows us to be able to get through those things, is that trust in God for that redemption at the end. And I think Jimmy made a good point about patience, right? A lot of these things are trials or tribulations, these things that we see as troubles. God allows those to be in our life to teach us patience, right? And to give us that ability to endure. That's a really important lesson that we have to learn. Why are we so bad at that, Jimmy?
I think it's just, we want what we want now. We don't want to have to work for it. It's just the general, maybe culture, society. And sometimes we let that influence our thinking at times if we're not 100% focused on the Word. And I think it's a slippery slope. You know, once you start down that path, that's why we have families and churches and brothers and sisters to bring us back. Hey, let's refocus here. But I think it's easy for anybody to get wrapped up into that.
Absolutely. I mean, we see it in Genesis chapter 3 with Eve, right? She looked at the fruit and it was beautiful and good to eat and would make her wise, right? So we understand the nature. I won't say the human nature, because I don't know that I love that phrase, but the nature of temptation, right? And one of the big things I think culturally that we've been enamored with over the last several decades anyway is this idea of I need it right now. How quickly can you get my pizza to me? And if it isn't 30 minutes, it's free, right? The idea that I see these commercials where the lady walks across the screen and says, everybody deserves fast internet. Like it's a basic human right to have fast internet for some reason. Things like that. We have been really indoctrinated in some way, or they've striven to indoctrinate us culturally, and that's the devil doing those things, to think that we need it right now, right how we want it, and that's exactly right. And that's counter to what God has instructed us, and counter to the example of the Scriptures. Have we ever seen anybody in the Scriptures with that attitude that things have gone well for them? I can't think of anybody. I think specifically of Samson and all of the struggles he had because of his lust and desire, and I want it how I want it right now, and how much of a struggle he had because of that. So we have to be very, very careful with that. Any further comments about Psalm 34?
When I read through specifically verse 20, when it says, "By their bones, not one of them shall be broken," I can't help but think of the promise made to Jesus. But yet in the context that we see here of going through trouble and afflictions, we know Jesus did. But yet he continued through them, regardless of how often it was and how much he faced. And so I think that's the key behind what he's saying here. Not that we're not going to face them, because he says that we are.
But about how we come through them. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Psalm 56 really echoes the trust David expresses in Psalm 34. And it doesn't look like we're going to make it very far at all, so we might as well just spend our time here in Psalm 56 and enjoy this one pair of Psalms, see what we can garner from them, and then I would encourage you to read the rest of this lesson through this week if you haven't already, and look at the other two pairs. Unfortunately, we're just not going to make it. I didn't manage our time well at all. But in Psalm 56, very similar thoughts in a lot of ways, but if I could have somebody just read through that psalm in its entirety together, all the way through verse 13.
Be merciful to me, O God, for man would swallow me up. Fighting all day, he oppresses me. My enemies would hound me all day, for there are many who fight against me, O Most High. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God, I will praise his word. In God, I have put my trust. I will not fear, All day they twist my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They gather together, they hide, they mark my steps when they lie in wait for my life. Shall they escape by iniquity? In anger cast down the peoples, O God. You number my wanderings, put my tears into your bottle. Are they not in your book? When I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back. This I know because God is for me. In God I will praise his word. In the Lord I will praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? Vows made to you are binding upon me, O God. I will render praises to you. For you have delivered my soul from death. Have you not kept my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living?
And so we see some similar language here, but to me this psalm really kind of leans more into what the enemies are doing to him, a little more of those who are oppressing him and how God can protect him from them. I really like verse 8. You have kept count of my, I believe it said wanderings. The ESV says tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? This idea that God's listening, that God knows when we have struggles. I like the word tossings there. I think about flopping around in your bed, not able to sleep at night. I woke up at 1 o'clock this morning. I guess I'd used my extra hour already, and I was convinced it was time to get up, or my body was convinced it was time to get up. I didn't have enough caffeine before I went to sleep, I guess, Aaron. But, and so I spent a fair bit of time this morning tossing. A lot of flopping over and wishing that I could go to sleep and waiting for the alarm to go off so that I could go ahead and get up. Should have just gotten up and done something else, I guess. But I can sympathize with this. I understand this idea of tossings, right, or wanderings, not being able to rest, having these struggles. And he says, put my tears in your bottle. Basically, you're storing these up. You understand and you know and you witness when I am suffering. And it's interesting that he goes from kind of this language of how hard things are and how many difficulties he has to finishing the psalm out. In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. And goes on to talk about the fact that he's got to continue doing what he's promised to do for God, that he's going to continue to render thanksgiving offerings to God. What promises do we make to God? We talk a lot about the promises that God has made for us, the promise of salvation, the promise of safekeeping, the promise of heaven, but what promises do we make to God?
To
Committing
remain
ourselves
faithful.
to learning, studying, living with this as our focus.
Commitment to learn, study, and live with this as our focus. What were you saying?
To remain faithful.
To remain faithful. Put concisely, to remain faithful. What else?
Like the way that we treat our spouse or our children. As Christians, we know really that we've made that promise to God even before them.
And we probably need to look at it that way a lot more often, don't we? And remember that.
After we mess up.
Alyssa says when the way that we treat our spouse or our children, we've really made that promise to God more than to them. Unfortunately, like she said, so often we don't really remember that until after we've messed up. But if we acted that way in everything that we did, we've promised that to God. We've promised God how we'll treat people in the world. We've promised God how we'll treat our employer or our job. We've promised God how we'll treat one another in our church family. Do we think about it that way? I know I don't as much as I should. And I thought this was a really interesting point that he made because I think it's important for us to have that mindset about us so that we can do a better job, right? So that we can stay more committed and so that we can maybe judge ourselves a bit more harshly when we self-reflect as to whether or not we've kept this promise to God. I don't know about, yes, sir.
I think it's easier to keep it all in perspective if you ask that question of how do we promise God we treat our enemies? Are those that hate us? Are those that persecute us? Or et cetera? If you enter into the new covenant and you know what he teaches about that, then that's you promising that you're going to do that. So if you remember how you should treat even the people who are actively trying to hurt you, it's real easy to remember the rest of that, I think, from the perspective standpoint.
And isn't it a shame sometimes that we treat our own family and our Christian family worse than we've promised God will treat our enemy, right? We've got to be very, very careful about that and be very serious about that and continue to reflect on what the Scriptures teach about what God expects from us as Christians. David understands it. David commits here again, I'm going to continue to do what I've promised you, God, because you have continued to do what you promised me. You've continued to be faithful to me. I'm going to continue to be faithful to you. In our last few moments here, lessons for today from this pair of Psalms, and then there's some more down there you can read as we go through, as you go through your week. Regardless of what else we may accomplish in this life, our greatest boast is without question a good relationship with the Lord. Everything else is insignificant. If you go back to Psalm 34 and verse 2, he says, my soul will boast in the Lord. Do we live our life that way? It's interesting to me, if I come across somebody and we're having a conversation, normally the first thing they ask me isn't, well, do you trust God? Or what church do you attend? Normally it's something like, what do you do for work? Or if they know I'm an engineer, do you go to Auburn or Alabama, right? That's the question they like to ask if they already know that I'm an engineer. Or depending on the context, it may be something totally different. But very rarely is the first question that somebody asks of me, do you boast in the Lord? Or something along those lines, right? But to be fair, that's very rarely probably the first question I ask of someone else. And maybe we need to change our mindset, change our priorities a bit, and be more cognizant of talking about that and using that as our basis for who we are. And we definitely don't need to creep into the worldly mindset of allowing all of these other things to define me. Yes, I have this employment, I have this many kids, and maybe I am part of this function or organization or whatever it may be. I have these achievements. None of that matters at all. All of that sits so far behind, I'm a Christian. I'm God's child. I'm one that has promised to make disciples until I die. That's what we need to focus on. That's what we need to be thinking about. I think this other one is interesting. We're out of time here, but fear will be either a negative or a positive experience, depending on whether it leads us to trust God less or more for deliverance. I'll leave you with that and let you think about that, but I do think that this is one we've probably seen and know of circumstances where both have occurred, right? Where somebody has had a very difficult situation that they've come through, and it was evident because of how they handled it, that defined them as more trusting in God, not less. But we also probably know the opposite, unfortunately, where someone has allowed fear and struggle and difficulty to dissuade them from being faithful in God. And we've got to be very careful that we don't allow that to happen in our lives. Any final comments as we close? Thank you for all of your input. Thank you so much.